Some days, English feels like a door that refuses to open no matter how many times you knocked. If you've been tired, slow, frustrated, or ready to quit because nothing seems to flow the way it should, this story from Denmark is for you. Today I'm sharing the quiet moments, the unexpected lessons, and the soft kind of love, quiet love, that taught me how to listen deeply, speak calmly, and finally hear myself again. The love I didn't hear. Imagine walking through a country where everything looks peaceful, yet inside your own head it feels like a storm that won't settle. That was me during my first weeks in Denmark. The strange thing wasn't the cold or the long hours of darkness, it was the silence. A silence so thick that it almost had weight. People talked softly, gently, as if they were afraid words might bruise the air. And there I was, clumsy in English, feeling like every sentence I tried to say was too loud, too awkward, too not enough. The more I tried to speak, the more I felt like my voice didn't belong anywhere. And that's when something weird happened. I started wondering whether love, any kind of love, had to be loud to be real. You see, back home love is everywhere. In noise and laughter and arguments. But here, love felt like a whisper I couldn't quite hear, a frequency my brain wasn't tuned to yet. Science says your brain is wired to panic when it can't predict sounds. It hates uncertainty, so it fills the silence with doubt. Mine certainly did. Every quiet pause from a Danish person felt like a signal that I'd failed somehow. Every soft or nod felt like a secret code I didn't understand. And when you're already struggling with English, those moments hit harder than they should. But here's the twist. Sometimes what you think is rejection is actually space. Space to breathe. Space to listen. Space to understand. I didn't know it then, but Denmark was about to teach me that not hearing something doesn't mean it's not there. That silence is an emptiness. It's an invitation. One afternoon, I noticed a couple on the train. They weren't holding hands. They weren't talking. They weren't even looking at each other. But the way they sat, shoulders relaxed, breath sinking like two soft rhythms, I suddenly realized this was love. Not loud, not dramatic, not movie style. Just quiet, steady, present. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe the love I'd been waiting to hear was already around me. I just didn't know how to listen. And that's where my journey begins. Not with the words I spoke, but with the ones I almost missed. Silence that followed me. There's a strange kind of silence in Denmark that doesn't chase you. It walks beside you, like a quiet friend who refuses to explain anything. First it felt harmless, but after a while it started following me everywhere. In the supermarkets where no one made small talk. On the buses where people sat like peaceful statues. Even in classrooms where students answered questions with 3 words and a polite smile. My brain, of course, acted like a drama queen. Congratulations, you are officially invisible. But here's the thing about silence. Your mind hates it because silence forces you to hear your own thoughts. And mine were not friendly. When you're learning English, especially in a place where people speak softly and precisely, every quiet second feels like a spotlight on your flaws. You start imagining that people are judging your accent, your grammar, your slowness. Even if, scientifically speaking, 99% of the time they're not thinking about you at all. Neuroscientists call this the spotlight illusion. You think everyone sees your mistakes, but they don't. They're too busy worrying about their own. I remember standing in a Danish bakery rehearsing the sentence, "Can I have one cinnamon roll, please?" in my head like I was preparing for a NASA mission. The woman behind the counter looked at me with the calmest eyes in the universe. I opened my mouth and nothing. My brain froze. Not because the sentence was hard, but because the silence before I spoke felt like a test I was destined to fail. She waited, gentle and patient, and my mind whispered, "Say something, anything, before she thinks you're weird." So I blurted the sentence out too fast, almost tripping over my own tongue. She smiled softly. "Of course," she said. Not annoyed, not confused, just kind. That moment stayed with me. It made me realize something uncomfortable. Silence wasn't making me anxious. I was making silence anxious. I was stuffing it with my fears, my insecurities, my imaginary judgment from strangers who probably forgot my face as soon as I walked out. But Denmark kept giving me more silence, and with it more lessons. The silence on the bike paths at 7 a.m. The silence in the snow-covered parks. The silence in conversations where people paused, not because they didn't care, but because they were actually thinking. Considering your words instead of rushing to fill the air. Slowly, I realized that maybe the silence wasn't following me. Maybe it was inviting me to slow down, to speak gently, to listen differently, to stop assuming that every quiet space meant failure. And maybe, just maybe, this quiet place was preparing me for a kind of love I didn't know how to hear yet. The night I broke down. There's a specific kind of loneliness that hits harder in a foreign country. The kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from feeling unheard even when people are around you. One cold evening in Copenhagen, that loneliness finally caught up with me. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears streaming in cinematic slow motion. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ribs and makes your heartbeat sound too loud. I had spent the whole day trying to follow conversations in English, slow, polite, Danish-style conversations, but my brain felt like a cheap radio with bad reception. Every sentence I heard came in pieces, and every sentence I said felt like stepping on linguistic Lego bricks. By the time I reached the lakes that night, my mind was exhausted from pretending to understand, pretending to be okay, pretending I wasn't drowning in silence. Psychologists say cognitive overload can trick your brain into believing you're failing, even when you're actually learning. That night, I believed the trick. I sat on a bench watching the city lights flicker on the water and thought, maybe I'm not made for this language thing. Maybe some people just don't get better. It's wild how quickly your mind can turn a bad day into a bad identity. A couple walked past me, laughing softly in Danish. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the warmth. And somehow that made me feel even worse. My chest tightened. I felt small, like the world was written in a code everyone else had access to except me. And then came the thought that scared me. What if I never hear love clearly? What if my English stays stuck inside my head forever? That's how the breakdown started, not with crying but with fear. The air was freezing but my palms were sweating. My throat tightened. Anxiety is a funny creature. It doesn't care how rational you try to be. It just decides, oh, you're vulnerable? Perfect. Let's make your lungs feel useless now. I tried to breathe. I tried to calm down. But the silence around me felt like a giant empty room where every doubt echoed. But here's the twist. Sometimes you break down not because you're weak, but because you finally hit the limit of carrying everything alone. My fear, my insecurity, my quiet confusion about love, language, belonging. It all collapsed that night by the lake. Looking back, I think that quiet breakdown was necessary. Denmark has this way of stripping noise out of your life until you have no choice but to face yourself. And that night, for the first time, I admitted I was scared. Not of English, but of not being understood. Little did I know someone was about to sit on that very bench and change everything. A stranger who saw me. The bench was cold, the kind of cold that makes your spine reconsider every life choice you've ever made. I was staring at the lake, pretending to be fine, when someone sat down beside me. Not close, not intrusive, just there. A tall Danish man in his late 60s, wearing a navy coat that looked older than my entire English vocabulary. He didn't look at me at first. He just breathed slow and steady, like the silence belonged to him. And then he said something so unexpected, so gentle I thought I had imagined it. You look like someone who is trying very hard to understand a world that is not trying to hurt you. My brain froze. Not because of the English, but because he somehow saw everything I had been hiding behind polite smiles and broken sentences. He turned to me, eyes soft, and continued. When I moved here from Iceland, I thought people were cold. Later, I realized they were simply quiet. There it was again. Quiet. The word I had been wrestling with for weeks. That I told him, in my messy, nervous English, that I felt like I was failing. Failing to understand. Failing to speak. Failing to exist without feeling invisible. He listened without interrupting. That alone felt like an act of love, a rare one, the kind that doesn't demand performance. Then he said something my brain still replays when life gets too loud. Silence is not a test. It is a space. You don't have to fill it perfectly. Just honestly. He explained how Danish communication relies on pauses, reflection, presence. We speak to think, he said, not to escape the silence between thoughts. Imagine that, a whole culture treating silence like a friend instead of a threat. He laughed softly and added, if your English is slow, good. Slow means you're thinking. Fast only means you're panicking. I swear my nervous system felt personally attacked. Psychologists call this social mirroring. When someone reflects your inner fears back to you without judgment, and suddenly everything feels lighter. That old man did exactly that. Not by lecturing me, not by giving a motivational speech, but simply by being present. Quietly present. Before leaving, he stood up, put on his gloves and said, you're not lost. You're adjusting. Give yourself permission to be new at something. Even love needs time to be understood. And then he walked away, disappearing into the snowy path like he'd never been there. But something stayed with me, a calmness I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, silence didn't feel like an enemy, felt like a teacher. The language behind the silence. There's a funny thing your brain does when someone finally gives you a new perspective. It starts seeing patterns you swear weren't there before. The day after meeting that stranger, it felt like Denmark had subtly shifted its frequency. Like the whole country was speaking a language I had been too busy panicking to hear, that I began noticing how people communicated even when they weren't talking. A barista would set my cup down gently, with a tiny smile that lasted half a second but somehow carried more warmth than a full conversation. A neighbor would nod once in the hallway, just once, but the gesture said, "I see you." In a way words couldn't. That's when it hit me. Maybe I had been listening only with my ears, while Denmark had been speaking to me with everything else. Scientists call this thin slicing. Your brain's ability to understand meaning from tiny fragments of behavior. Turns out the silence I'd been terrified of was actually full of microscopic signals. Soft cues, subtle warmth, unspoken reassurance. I'd missed them because I was too focused on trying to sound fluent instead of trying to feel connected. One evening, I watched a Danish couple in a cafe. No intense eye contact. No grand gestures. Just a quiet exchange of glances, a shared sip of tea, a relaxed posture. It wasn't the loud kind of love you see in movies. It was the kind of love that doesn't need an audience. A quiet love. The kind I once mistook for coldness. And as strange as it sounds, this changed the way I approached English too. I stopped obsessing over perfect pronunciation and started paying attention to the rhythm of conversations. The pauses, the breaths, the soft, people used to show they're listening. English stopped feeling like a performance. It started feeling like a presence. My brain, of course, was confused at first. It kept asking, are we learning language or learning emotional telepathy? Honestly, it felt like both. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Communication isn't just about words. It's about intention, energy, the quiet feelings tucked between syllables. The more I paid attention, the more I realized I'd been speaking my own language loudly, but listening to theirs quietly. And that mismatch, more than grammar, more than accent, was what made everything feel wrong. So I slowed down. I let conversations breathe. I stopped rushing to fill every silence with noise. And the wildest thing happened. I started understanding more English precisely because I was talking less. Maybe love, like language, has its own volume setting. And maybe the important things aren't always loud. Learning to listen again. Here's a strange truth your brain won't admit. Sometimes you're not bad at a language. You're just bad at trusting yourself. I realized this on a windy afternoon at the Copenhagen harbor, where the air smelled like salt, coffee, and a small identity crisis. I had my headphones on, replaying the same English audio lesson for the 15th time, when a ridiculous thought popped into my head. What if the problem isn't my ears, but the way I listen? Think about it. Your brain is a chaotic roommate. It doesn't listen to understand. It listens to survive. When you hear English, your brain doesn't say, "Oh great, new knowledge." No, it says, "Emergency. Unknown sound. Prepare embarrassment protocol." And suddenly every word feels like a threat. Every sentence like a puzzle you're too tired to solve. That was me for months, listening with fear instead of curiosity. But Denmark, in its quiet, almost smug way, kept teaching me different. One day I watched a little Danish boy trying to talk to his dad in English. His grammar was a disaster. His pronunciation sounded like he had swallowed half the alphabet. But he wasn't stressed. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't shrinking like a scared turtle. He was just trying. Joyfully. Loudly. Confidently. And the dad listened with the patience of a monk who had never met anxiety, and that moment, something clicked. I wasn't listening like a learner. I was listening like someone preparing to fail, so I made a wild decision. I started listening badly. Not perfectly. Not intensely. Just naturally. Like a kid watching cartoons. I let my mind wander. I didn't stop the audio every time I missed a word. I didn't beat myself up for not understanding every syllable. I let English wash over me like rain instead of interrogating every drop. And the craziest thing happened. I understood more. See, neuroscientists say your brain learns faster when it's relaxed. A stressed brain shuts its doors. A curious brain leaves them open. My problem wasn't vocabulary, it was tension. Tight shoulders. Tight expectations. Tight fear of being misunderstood. But watching that little boy loosen something inside me, I started practicing quiet listening. No pressure. No testing myself. No racing to respond, just listening the way Denmark taught me, gently, patiently, with space between thoughts. And slowly, almost secretly, English started making sense in a new way. Sentences felt smoother. Conversations felt lighter. Silence stopped triggering panic and started feeling like guidance. My ears, once terrified, began to trust the world again. Maybe that's what quiet love really is. The love you show yourself when you stop yelling at your brain and start listening to your life. Quiet love in practice. By the time I had spent a few months in Denmark, I began noticing love in the smallest details. Quiet, subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. It wasn't the kind of grand gestures you see in movies or Instagram posts. It was in how the barista remembered my favorite tea without me saying a word. In the way neighbors gave a small nod in the hallway that said, "I see you and you belong here." These tiny actions whispered a language louder than any shouting could that I started applying the same principle to learning English. Instead of forcing myself to speak loudly or quickly, I began practicing in small, meaningful doses. One sentence at a time. One gentle conversation at a time. I wrote letters to myself in English, read aloud slowly, and repeated phrases until they felt natural. Just like the quiet love I witnessed around me, small, consistent acts created change over time. No one applauded me, no one noticed, but that didn't matter. Progress doesn't need an audience. Science actually supports this. Studies in neuroscience show that repetition in low-stress environments strengthens neural pathways more effectively than stressful, fast-paced drilling. In other words, patience wins. Small actions over time become the foundation for real skill. And in the case of communication, it's not about loudness. It's about clarity, presence, and consistency. I remember one evening sitting at a cafe, listening to a couple converse softly in Danish. I couldn't understand all the words, but I understood their rhythm, their pauses, and the warmth in their voices. It struck me that this was love in its most effective form. Subtle, patient, and consistent. That realization became my mantra for English practice. Speak softly. Listen fully. Connect honestly. The loud, forced English I once chased was replaced by something deeper, something enduring. Soon I noticed that people responded differently too. My quieter, slower speech was met with patience. Conversations became more meaningful. Misunderstandings decreased. And oddly enough, my confidence grew, not from proving I could speak fast, but from proving I could communicate clearly and kindly. This quiet approach changed my life in Denmark. I discovered that the world doesn't demand you shout to be heard. It only asks that you show up, consistently with attention and care. Love doesn't have to be loud, and learning a language doesn't have to be painful. Both require patience, presence, and the courage to embrace silence as part of the process. In those small, subtle interactions, both in love and language, I realized loudness is optional. Consistency, patience, and quiet observation are what truly make connections last. Finding my voice. After months of quiet observation and slow practice, something remarkable happened. I began to find my own voice. Not the voice I imagined would impress anyone. Not the polished voice I had chased back home, but a voice that felt real, grounded, and present. It came not from rushing or forcing, but from listening first, speaking second, and embracing the pauses in between. My English had become my companion rather than a judgmental taskmaster, and for the first time, I felt confident enough to speak slowly, clearly, and meaningfully. It started in small ways. Ordering coffee, chatting with neighbors, asking for directions. Each interaction felt less like a performance and more like a conversation. I stopped worrying about every mispronounced word or forgotten article. I focused on connecting, on being understood, and on understanding others. And almost magically, people responded in kind. They slowed down, they smiled more, they listened. My voice mattered because I allowed it to matter, not because I tried to make it perfect. Psychologists call this the self-affirming loop. When you treat yourself kindly and speak from a place of confidence, others mirror that energy back to you. My quiet voice began creating quiet connections, tiny yet profound, each one reinforcing my belief that I could communicate, that I could belong, that I could love and be loved, even in a foreign language, even in a foreign land. And then came the revelation about love itself. Just as my English had grown strong and resilient through slow, patient practice, so had my understanding of relationships. Love didn't need to shout to exist. The soft gestures, the small acts of attention, the quiet presence, they carried more weight than grand declarations. I realized that being heard doesn't require volume. Being present does. Being understood doesn't require perfection. Being genuine does. I remember walking along the snow-covered streets of Copenhagen one evening, reflecting on everything I had learned. The quiet cafes, the patient strangers, the soft conversations. They had all taught me that the loudest moments aren't always the most meaningful. Sometimes the quietest voice is the one that resonates the longest. And that, finally, is the essence of quiet love and slow, mindful English practice. Consistency, presence, and patience. Small actions repeated with intention, soft words spoken with care, and a heart willing to listen deeply. The love you seek and the language you wish to master are not in the noise, but in the silence you are brave enough to inhabit.